need to catch up sometime, which means we never will catch up, but that doesn't matter. We at least need to get started. We're going to be talking about authorship of the Bible and authorship of the different books. Now, just so you know, I have far too much material for the hour that we're going to have, so we're just going to deal with the bigger issues first. If we have time to deal with some of the smaller ones, we'll delve into that, and we'll get as far as we're able in the time that we have. And we'll take care of that. First of all, so then we need to talk about what the detractors say. As I told you, I have conversations with atheists all the time. And here's what the detractors say, that if the Gospels weren't written by the disciples, they're just hearsay. And therefore they are easily discredited. You know, if we don't know the authors, then it was just, and if it was just passed down for years before being written, we can just about guarantee that many of the stories have been made up. And if we don't know the authors, the Bible loses all credibility. An old book written by whoever is not sufficient evidence to make supernatural claims about the truths of reality. Now, those are quotes from the conversations I have. Lets you know what the atheist community is saying, but possibly it's something that you've thought yourselves. I had a meeting with a journalist, one of the guys who teaches journalism at UB, one of the profs, and I had a meeting with him. We're friends for other reasons, but I said, you know, how important is it that we know who the author was? And of course, I had a hidden agenda because I know the Gospels are anonymous. And he said, oh, it means everything. If you don't know who the author is, you know, we can't publish it. If you don't know your source, it won't go to print. And of course, that's a journalist's viewpoint, but it shows me, you know, why the issue of authorship is so important. And so I did want to talk about, you know, why authorship matters, why authorship is important. First of all, in my mind, and of course these are things that make a difference to me, in my mind it gives credibility to the text. If the people who wrote it actually spoke with God. See, that matters to me. If you're talking about the prophet Isaiah, and if it wasn't written for 600 years later, and you say, well, what difference does it matter if it was Josiah rather than Isaiah? Well, except that, did Josiah talk with God, or did he just write this stuff down? See, Isaiah, you know, is the one who talked with God. So if we don't have Isaiah's writings, then we don't have the credibility of, this is what the Lord said to me. If it wasn't written by prophets, then it was written by normal human beings with normal access to normal information. It's as if you or I wrote it. I'm not a prophet. I don't have prophetic access to the prophetic word. And so if it wasn't written by the prophets, who wrote it? It was just Joe Smith who wrote it. And he didn't have access to prophetic information, the word of the Lord. So that matters to me too. Third of all, there are so many sayings, admissions, there are so many sayings and quotes in the Bible referring back to Moses said, in Isaiah it is written, David said, for instance, and if Moses and Isaiah and David aren't the authors, then are these other guys wrong? For instance, might as well get right to it. Is Jesus wrong? Did Jesus lie to us when he said, Moses told you, blah, blah, blah? Did Jesus lie to us when he said, David wrote? So how do we know? No, and then you say, well, maybe Jesus was just referring to, well, traditionally you understand, but that's not what Jesus said. And what Jesus said matters to me. And if Jesus said, then that casts doubt on the text. Now it casts doubt on all kinds of integrity. So you can tell where I'm going with this, because in my talk this morning, I already told you that I consider the Bible to be authoritative and reliable. And so the fourth thing I have to say here is then Detractors use authorship to discredit the text, right? If the eyewitnesses didn't write it, they say, it's virtually valueless. If the authors are unknown, then the text is unreliable. That's what they said. So that's why authorship is important to me. But I think we have to honestly consider the truth about ancient documents that we have. We have Hammurabi's Code that was written back in the days of Abraham. Do we know who wrote Hammurabi's Code? Who wrote it? Nobody knows. Do we throw it out? No. We don't throw it out just because we don't know who the author was. We have pottery shards with writing on them that the archaeologists and the scientists, look at this document we have. Look, do we know who wrote that? We don't. Do we throw it out? No. Dr. Blomberg was showing you Baruch's seal, right? Baruch, who was the amanuensis of Jeremiah. Do we know who actually carved that thing? Do we know who wrote it? No. But that doesn't mean we throw it out. We need to understand the reality of ancient documentation. We hardly know who wrote anything. And if we applied the same standards to the scripture that we apply to traditional history, for instance, we have documents that were written by Suetonius, a Roman historian. Or I could claim, or so they say. Can you prove to me that Suetonius wrote those? No, we accept that Suetonius wrote them because Suetonius is a known Roman historian, and he says he wrote them, and other people say he wrote them, but how do we know? To me, it's no different when people accept, of course Suetonius wrote that, but then why don't they accept that John wrote John? See, to me, there's a bit of disingenuous there. That's a double standard that is very common with detractors of Scripture, that, they'll accept this in the secular world, but they don't accept it in the biblical world. And to me, it's hypocritical. For instance, and maybe I'm stealing my own thunder, but I'll talk about this now. They always talk about, we have 4 separate biographers of Jesus in the 4 Gospels. And they all, if we want to say, disagree with each other. If I can say it that way, they disagree with each other. And the detractors say those things were written decades after Jesus lived, so they're unreliable. Do you know that the only thing we know about Alexander the Great, just to pick a small figure in history, the only things we know about Alexander the Great are from 4 sources that all disagree with each other, and they are from centuries after Alexander lived. Look it up on Wikipedia. That's all we know about Alexander the Great. Centuries after he lived, from 4 different authors who disagree with each other. Do they throw Alexander the Great out? Absolutely not. Do they throw the Gospels out? They do. It's a double standard and it's hypocritical. But let's talk about authorship, because I don't want to get off track. I just want to show you the reality of ancient documentation and how people are so hypocritical about the Bible and critical of the text when they're not applying those same standards to secular history. Bob talked about the Old Testament canon. And I would like to talk a little bit more about that because I think there's one thing that he did not mention. There were these debates about the New Testament canon as to which books belonged in and which did not. And as he just said about 15 minutes ago, the books of most debate were 2 Peter, James, and Hebrews. Do you know there has never, to our knowledge, there has never been any debate or any question about the 39 books of the Old Testament. Every record we have, without fail, in total consistency and total unanimity, has the same 39 books, and they are all recognized as Scripture. There is never any record that we have where any of the 39 books of the Old Testament, we don't have a list that has only 37 of them. We don't have any list. Every list we have, 39, the same ones. And so there is the canon of the Old Testament has never been in doubt as far as we know. We have no record of anything any different than that. Every collection has the same books, none missing, none added. Now, some group them differently, where it might be 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 3 Kings, and 4 Kings instead of 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, but it's the same books. And so, regardless that we may not know some of the authors or the situation of their writing, the books included have been, without exception, recognized as authoritative. And that, to me, means something. It's very meaningful. But let's talk first about, as I said, the most important ones, and then we will circle back. That's going to be up there for a while. Let's talk about the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Bible traditionally attributed to Moses. And this is one of the huge battlegrounds of biblical authorship. Did Moses write the Pentateuch? Every biblical attestation is that he did. Joshua says in the books that Moses wrote down for us, it's consistent through the Samuels and the Kings. Oh, and they brought the law of Moses out, right? It's consistent. When we get to Jesus, and Moses said, Did modern scholarship, though, says Moses never wrote that stuff. And so the debate ensues. Did Moses write the Pentateuch? It's a huge and it's a complex issue. There are books and books and books written about the authorship of the Pentateuch. So obviously, I'm only going to brush over the surface of it, but I will give you what I think is good information. But I don't want to give the impression that this is a simple matter and just sort of blow it off as if it's elementary, my dear Watson. First of all, you really need to know that Hebrew as a language was not invented until about 1000 BC. Most people do not realize that. Hebrew didn't evolve. It didn't exist. No one spoke Hebrew till about the time of King David. English evolved. Have you ever tried to read Beowulf in the original English? You can hardly make sense out of it. It's not the English we know as English. Every once in a while you can catch some words. Even when we read the Declaration of Independence, they did some of their letters funny, and it's a different kind of English than we use. Languages evolve. Hebrew evolved as a language, and it didn't really become what is recognizably Hebrew until about the time of King David. And therefore, I'm going to start this conversation with this that may not be obvious to you. Moses did not speak Hebrew. We actually don't know what language Moses spoke. We know he was raised in Egypt, but he was raised by his mama. And he must have spoken some version of Egyptian that was recognized there. One of the sort of the universal languages of the area was Akkadian. It's possible that Moses spoke Akkadian. We don't really know what language Moses spoke. And this is so important for the authorship issue. I can guarantee you that Moses did not write the text that we have today, because the text that we have today is a Hebrew text. So at best, we have a translation of something that Moses wrote. That's the best we've got, and we know that for a fact because Hebrew did not exist in the days of Moses, we don't know what he would have written in. So that's an important factor. We do not have Moses' words, just like we do not have Jesus' words, because Jesus spoke Aramaic and the Gospels are written in Greek. We have a translation. We have only a few of Jesus' words. His Aramaic words from the cross, for instance, were probably directly out of his mouth. Everything else we have is a translation. So also with Moses. At best, we have a translation. Second, there is absolutely zero evidence outside of the Bible that corroborates Moses' writing. We don't have anything that says, oh, there was this guy Moses and he wrote this stuff too long ago. We have no such thing. Not only that, we have no historical evidence outside of the Bible that there even was a guy named Moses. So if you're going to be talking to atheists, they're not even going to go with the presupposition that there was a guy named Moses, because he has not been found in any Egyptian records. He has not been found in any archaeological thing anywhere. Now, you should know that absence of evidence does not mean there's evidence of absence. Just because we don't have a record doesn't mean he didn't exist. But you should know that we don't have anything aside from the Bible that says that a guy named Moses existed and that a guy named Moses wrote anything. It hasn't been found yet. Therefore, the entire case that Moses lived, that Moses did or did not write the books of the Bible, is, if we were going to be academically fair, an educated evaluation based on internal evidence. Internal meaning the Bible is all we have to go by. We have nothing external to the Bible to tell us anything one way or another. There are clues that the scholars think they see. They look at the grammatical styles. They look at the content, see internal evidence to try to figure out who wrote this stuff. Is this the same writing style as this? Do they use the same words in Genesis? Do they use the same terminology that they use in Deuteronomy? Can we look at the style of the writing? Is it the same between Numbers and Exodus? You understand? Internal evidence. They look at all this stuff and try to decide who wrote this, which is all, I know it's educated, but if I can say, it's subjective. We've got nothing hard to go by anywhere. So saying, there is no end to the debates about who wrote the Pentateuch. Penta, 5, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, as to who wrote the Pentateuch. Many writers in the Bible, as I told you, claimed that Moses wrote it. Jesus claimed that Moses wrote it. For Christians, it's not a matter of dispute. If Jesus said it, then Moses wrote it. We're good with that, but we need to talk about it a little deeper than that. In the late 18th century, in about the 1880s or so, there was a guy named Julian Wellhausen who came up with a theory that Moses did not write the Pentateuch, nor did Joshua nor anybody else close to Moses, but somebody like during the years of exile in about 400 BC. Actually, there were 4 authors, they say, that wrote this. J, the guy who called God Yahweh. E, somebody who calls God Elohim. P, a bunch of priests, probably under Ezra. And D, a Deuteronomist. And what they say is that the Pentateuch is a patchwork quilt of 4 separate sources. It's called the JEDPD theory. It's called, or right? The Wellhausen hypothesis, or and so they say, and that gained quite a large following, because people, oh yeah, we're ready to discredit the Bible. Moses didn't write it. Of course, Wellhausen is right, and they, Moses. It's called the documentary theory, but you need to know that theory reigned supreme for about 100 years. But as of late, scholars, and you need to know this because it comes up in conversations, well, what about the JEDP? What about Wellhausen? What about the documentary theory? There are scholars of late, based on things that archaeologists have found in computers and recent scholarship, that has pretty much been able to bury the whole JEPD theory of Bible authorship, of Pentateuchal authorship. That has not made its way down to the lay community. The atheists will still throw JEPD in your face, but it has been largely discredited. So then, who wrote Moses? Who wrote the books? If it maybe wasn't the patchwork quilt that Wellhausen talked about, who wrote the Pentateuch, and how do we know? I would say it this way. Perhaps I could give you an analogy. Because we know Moses didn't write the words we have. I already told you that. He didn't write in Hebrew. Supposing that I were going to write a book of the collected sayings of Abraham Lincoln, and I did a whole lot of research, and I found hundreds, if not thousands, of quotes of Abraham Lincoln. And I put those together without any comment from me into a book that I called The Quotes of Abraham Lincoln. Who wrote that book? I did, but I didn't. Abe wrote it. All the words are his. I'm the one who wrote the book. My name might be on the cover, but none of the words are mine. The words belong to Honest Abe. And so, he is clearly the author of the book, but I am the author of the book. He put them down on paper, but I'm the one who put them down on paper. Do you understand the confusion that I'm trying to deliberately create here? Because I think it's legitimate to the question of authorship of the Pentateuch. Is it his work or mine? He is clearly the authority behind the work, but I'm the one who compiled them a century and a half later. Now, suppose in addition that I was to confirm in the course of my research some of the biographical acts, some of the things that Abe had done. Suppose I found memoirs, where a diary of Abe, where he wrote, well, on Tuesday I cut down a cherry tree. I know that's the George Washington fable, but okay. So suppose I found these two, and suppose I put those into my book. Again, who wrote the book? My point is this: is it altogether possible that what we have in the Pentateuch was assembled, translated, and assembled centuries later? Just like some of the detractors say that it was, except that maybe it's the exact words and the exact actions of Moses. And so, who can we say wrote this book? I think it's fair to say Moses wrote it. Moses, the authority behind it. Moses is the official source of this material. But if anybody were to do a linguistic study, they would find language in it and styles in it that were centuries later, right? If I were to write a biography of Honest Abe, it's going to have some 20th century, 21st century stylistic elements to it that would have not have been there if it came straight out of 1864. I think that's what we're seeing in the Pentateuch, that they are finding various stylistic elements. They find where they say, this seems to have written by various hands, but I think it's fair to say that Moses is the authority. Moses is the source material. Moses is the person who wrote the book, but we know that he didn't write in Hebrew, so it had to have been put together at least, because we don't even know when Moses existed, when he lived, at least 300 years later when Hebrew came into existence as a language. But that doesn't mean Moses didn't write it. That doesn't mean Moses isn't the source or the authority. We don't even know what Moses may have written on. Did he write on clay shards? Did he, like the Mesopotamians wrote on clay tablets? Did Moses write on a clay tablet? Very easily he could have. We don't even know what language he wrote. So I think whoever pieced together the Pentateuch, and let's agree that it was pieced together, because I can't imagine Moses wrote. Have you seen the scroll of Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls? It's a long piece of parchment. Now, Isaiah is a long book, but so is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Where was all that written? The Egyptians had papyrus. We don't know where or how it was preserved, but I'm sure, I can say with certainty, they were much closer to the source material than we are, because we are 3,500 years later. But Joshua says that Moses wrote a book, and I believe that. The Kings and the Chronicles say that Moses wrote a book, and I believe that. The Ezra says Moses wrote a book. Josiah says Moses wrote a book. Jesus says Moses wrote a book. I'm going to go with that, because as we found today, the Bible is authoritative and reliable. And even though people may say to you, yeah, but it has this different terminology and different styles in it, yes, I can tell you for certain it was not compiled until centuries later. It's in Hebrew. There's no other choice. But that doesn't take away that Moses is the authoritative source of the material. Now, as Bob would just explain to us before, when we talked about manuscripts and canonization, what we believe is that God would have superintended the entire process so that the text that we have is the inspired Word of God. That God would have superintended not only the words that Moses put down, but also inspired the translation of the Hebrew collaborator centuries later to have put down the words that we have in the Hebrew that we have. Even if Moses didn't actually, well, let me read a quote from another brother of mine, Dr. John Walton. I don't know if you're familiar with my brother John. He's an Old Testament professor at Wheaton College, has written beaucoup books. He claims that the authorship of the Pentateuch by Moses cannot be verified by evidences outside the Bible. And of course we know that's true. But it is clear that Moses was considered the authority behind the 5 books we have. His words, teachings, and actions can be considered to be represented with accuracy in the biblical text. As the leader of the people, Moses was generating information that would be considered important enough to preserve in written documents, and some undoubtedly would have been recorded in his time and under his supervision. Others may well have been produced by later generations after some time of oral transmission. But Craig talked to you about oral transmission. It was a reliable mechanism of information transmission. It matters neither how much material is in each category, nor which portions are which. The authority derives from Moses, and Moses is inseparable from the material, just like Abe Lincoln would be inseparable from the material in my analogy. Even if Moses didn't actually write it, we have no verifiable reason to doubt that the material is his. And that would be the stance I would take on the authorship of the Pentateuch. lest I spend my entire time on those 5 books. I told you it's a very deep subject, but we need to keep moving. Let's talk about the Psalms, because the Psalms are another place of attack. I really do want to get to Isaiah and the Gospels, so I'm going to keep rolling. The book of Psalms is a mixed bag. I hope you know that. The Bible does not even claim that most of the Psalms were written by David. There are Psalms you can check through. I think there's a couple dozen that were written by the sons of Korah. There are some Psalms that don't have a label on them. We have no idea who wrote them, but we don't necessarily assume that David wrote them. We know that at least one of the Psalms was written by Moses. Psalm number 90 was written by Moses. So nobody contends that they were all written by the same person. Nobody contends that all of the Psalms were written in 1000 BC during the lifetime of David. Nobody does. We call them the Psalms of David, but we know that they're not. Archaeology is able to confirm some very early dates because of the style of writing, and the archaeology is able to tell us some of the Psalms indeed are from 1000 BC. Some of the Psalms, according to styles and everything else, they say are from about 540 BC, and that would be Psalms 126 and Psalm 137. But those Psalms aren't attributed to David, so this is not a problem for us. We know that some of the Psalms were written by other people. It's no big deal. It is widely accepted that the Psalms were not assembled into the form that we have them till about 500 BC, which would have been in Babylon. That's where they were assembled. 73 of the Psalms are attributed to David. Solomon wrote some of the Psalms. Asaph wrote some of them. Heman, Ethan, as I said, the sons of Korah. It's impossible to know the accuracy of those labels, but this is not a problem that some of the Psalms were written as late as 542 BC. It's okay. It does not discredit the text, because we're not claiming that all of them were written in 1000. Let's talk about Isaiah, just so I can keep moving. Isaiah is probably one of the most complicated authorship issues of the Bible, just so you know that. And I can't begin to deal with it in its entirety here. It's very complex. It is highly debated. It's one of the hottest authorship debates in academia. But I think it's best to understand Isaiah similar to everything I said about Moses and the Pentateuch. Isaiah can easily be seen as the authority figure behind the writing of Isaiah, even if, especially from chapters 40 on, is thought to be, the style completely changes when we get to chapter 40 from what it had been from Isaiah 1 to 39. Is this a problem? No, it's not a problem, because that was probably compiled by someone else's hand later on. But just like I would write a biography of Lincoln, somebody else was writing to us the words of Isaiah. And because, again, Isaiah is such a foundational book in the Old Testament, and the New Testament quotes from Isaiah by specific context, Isaiah said, and because I believe in the authority and the inspiration of Scripture, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Jesus, and Paul, that when they say Isaiah wrote this, I can take that at face value. I can take that as authoritative and reliable. Was Isaiah's hand actually in it? Possibly not. But that does not discredit that Isaiah was not the authority behind the text. Some sections, they're pretty sure, were transcribed by people who were with him. Most of the writers of the Bible, just so you know, did not write their own stuff. In those days, most of them had secretaries. They had scribes, specialists in writing. Some people say, for instance, I'll just jump ahead a little bit just because time rolls on. For instance, the book of 1 Peter is a fairly sophisticated Greek Greek terminology, Greek grammar, and they're saying, are you kidding me? A Galilean fisherman could never write in such a high philosophical style as the book of 1 Peter. But we don't need to assume that it was written actually by the hand of Peter, because most things were written with the help of a secretary, where Peter would have stand here and said, now let me tell you, here's what I'm trying to write. And, Peter would tell him, and the guy would write it, and Peter would say, now read it back to me, and the guy would read it, and he'd say, yeah, that's what I'd like to say. But it's written in a very high style. See, if you put yourself there, we don't have a problem with this. I don't have a problem with Peter dictating his text to a secretary who writes it in his own hand, reads it back to Peter, and Peter says, yeah, I approve. I'll sign off on that. This happened a lot in the Bible, and, so what if the style of 1 Peter is too educated for a Galilean fisherman? Peter probably used an educated Judean to write it for him. Or actually, it may have been written in Rome, for all we know. And that doesn't detract from its authority. In the same way, there is no reason except cynicism to tell us that Isaiah did not write what we have in Isaiah. There is no external evidence. All of the internal evidence is educated evaluations. I was going to say guesswork, but I should be a little more fair than that. Educated evaluations from internal evidences, but I don't think there's any reason to suspect that he didn't write much of it down himself, though other sections would have been transcribed later by persons who were with him, and some was possibly added in later years when all of the prophecies of Isaiah were compiled. Nobody's necessarily gathering that stuff when Abe Lincoln is alive, but after he's shot, you know what? They start gathering up all these little napkins that he wrote on and pulling things together. This is a historic person. And so even though Isaiah may have written 1 to 39 himself, and there's no evidence that he didn't, and then they say the style completely changes, but that may be because later on, after Isaiah died, somebody's thinking, we need to preserve the rest of Isaiah's words. And so they start gathering up the napkins and gathering up the pottery shards and everything that has Isaiah stuff in it, and they put that together themselves under the superintendency of the inspiration of God. And we have Isaiah 1 through 66, and I don't have a problem with that kind of assemblage. What I do have a problem with is the Wellhausen school of assemblage, where it was written not by Isaiah, not by Moses at all, not by people who had heard the voice of the Lord, not by people who had met face to face with God, but just by people who were writing down stories. I have a problem with that because we take the authority out of it. But there's no reason to take the authority out of it. The New Testament repeatedly affirms Isaiah as the author of his prophecies, which would not only give evidence, but inspiration with regard to Isaiah as the author. None of the disagreements detracts from Isaiah being both the direct source and the authority of the writings that have been put in his name. Let's talk about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. They are probably the most fought-over territory of the Bible because if we can discredit the Gospels, we can discredit the whole theology of Jesus. If we can take the Gospels down, then we can cut the legs out from under Christianity. The Gospels are under tremendous attack in this era, so we need to talk about them. That's why I'm trying to give them a little more attention. I would try to get to the whole rest of the Bible, but it doesn't look like we're going to get that, so let's at least talk about the Gospels. They want to steal away from the authority of the Bible. First of all, you probably know, but you should if you don't even know, that all of the Gospels are anonymous. None of them have a signature. None of them start with, from Paul the Apostle to his brother Timothy in Philippi. None of them start with, I, James, to the 12 tribes that are scattered about. None of the Gospels mention, as author, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All of them, all 4 of them, are anonymous. But that's the nature of the genre. If you pick up a novel by Dostoevsky, he's not in the novel. He doesn't put his name in there anywhere. He's the author. He's not in the work. In that sense, unless he signed his name to the front of it, you wouldn't know it was by Fyodor himself. It's the nature of novelists that they don't put their own name in the work itself. It was the nature of the Gospels not to put your name in the work. And so it doesn't surprise us, it shouldn't surprise us that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't say, and I, Matthew, wrote this. That was not the kind of book that it was. I don't think its anonymity, therefore, has any effect on its authenticity. Just like if you tore the cover off of Crime and Punishment, you wouldn't know who wrote it. And that doesn't take away from the quality of the work that Crime and Punishment is. But we have to examine the evidence that we have and infer the most reasonable conclusion, rather than insist on ultimate proof. So you need to know that the superscription, according to Matthew, even though Matthew didn't put it there, the superscription, according to Matthew, is on every single edition that we have. Every gospel record of Matthew's gospel says, according to Matthew. Sometimes it's in a different handwriting, but it's there every time. On every edition that has been found, the earliest edition we have of the Gospel of Matthew is somewhere around AD 200. It says according to Matthew on it. And through the centuries, every edition of the ancient manuscripts that we have all say according to Matthew. There is no copy without his name on it. We have the testimony of Papias, writing in about 125 AD, a good 75 years before our earliest manuscript of Matthew. We have the testimony of Papias of Hierapolis saying, Matthew wrote a gospel for us. We have a testimony by Irenaeus saying, Matthew wrote a gospel for us. We have all of the early church fathers were unanimous in attributing Matthew to Matthew. There is no record until the 20th century that says Matthew didn't write Matthew. To me, that has a whole lot of substance. That's evidence, that's a whole truckload of evidence all by itself. Modern scholarship doubts Matthew's authorship on the basis of the fact that the author seemed to have used source material. So what? I mean, I know I'm not trying to belittle the academic accusation. We could talk about that a long time, but the claim is that one of Jesus' disciples who had walked with him and lived with him for 3 years wouldn't have needed source material. Well, I understand that, but it's possible you also need to understand that the way oral tradition worked is that these stories were sort of memorized and passed down from campfire to campfire and from dining room table to dining room table until they were solidified into a form. Just like Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown. How could you all say it the same? Have you copied from each other? No, it's oral tradition. We've learned, Jack and Jill. We've all learned it the same way. We're all going to tell it the same way. The Gospels, it was an era of oral tradition. They were in transition. The first century was an era of transition from oral tradition to written. Just like we, in our era, are in a situation of transition from written to digital. This era in future centuries will be looked on the same way the first century was when they were transitioning from oral to written. We are transitioning ourselves from written to digital forms of communication. And so what that they all told the story the same? That was part of the nature of oral tradition. It was to tell the story the same. We had learned it. So that doesn't mean that Matthew didn't write it. Besides, they argue Mark wasn't even an eyewitness. Mark did his research. Mark knew the oral traditions, and the evidence is quite strong that Mark got his gospel from Peter. Mark and Peter were friends. Mark and Peter were in Rome at the same time when the gospel was most likely written. And so I would expect that Peter and Matthew are going to tell the same stories in the same way about what happened to Jesus. These are the kind of accusations that come against Matthew. But to me, the argument in terms of Matthew's authorship is stronger that Matthew wrote it than that he didn't. There's substantial evidence that Matthew could easily have been the author. The author was obviously a highly educated Jew from the way he wrote. Matthew was a highly educated Jew. He was a tax collector. The author was familiar with the technical aspects of the Jewish law. Matthew would have been that person. Or Levi, who was probably of the tribe of Levi. Of course, he would know all about the law, and he would write about the law, and the Gospel of Matthew is all about the law. The interest of the Gospel is in the law and in ecclesiastical matters. Laws and customs, and somebody who is trained in this discipline would write that way, and Matthew was trained in those disciplines. Why are we doubting that Matthew was the author of the gospel? The gospel's parables that he tells that Jesus told are very much reflecting interest in the spiritual of Israel as God's chosen people. Who would we expect to write that way? Matthew. The level of Greek fits a man who was native of Palestine during that era, but who regularly did business in the Greek language. And you should know that Mark is not the only source of math that's in Matthew. There are even scholars now who are wondering if Matthew was written before Mark. That shows you how speculative all of this internal evidence stuff is. The sharp language about various Jews in the Gospel of Matthew, again, reflects some of the battles that were going on in Judaism at the time, and that's something that somebody named Matthew or Levi, who was a tax collector, would be interested in writing about. Everything about the Gospel of Matthew reflects who we knew Matthew to have been. Every attestation by the church fathers says that Matthew was the writer. Every copy we have says, according to Matthew on it. I think the evidence is substantial that Matthew was the author of Matthew. Mark is also anonymous. Mark was not an eyewitness. He was not one of the disciples, but there's every reason for us to believe that Mark may have been one of the followers of Jesus during his lifetime, and he may have been an eyewitness himself to many of these things, even though people say, well, Mark wasn't one of the disciples. But don't you know, when you read in the book of Acts, Mark's mama was a strong follower of Jesus, and the church met in her house. We know that Mark was very well acquainted with Paul, but because Mark's mama lived in Jerusalem, and the early church met in her house. Now, where do you think little Mark grew up? Mark grew up in Jerusalem. Who was active in Judea and Galilee during the time of Mark's childhood? Jesus was. You know, there are some pretty strong speculations. You know, at the end of the Gospel of Mark, where it says that there were more people in the Garden of Gethsemane than just the disciples. And when the Roman soldiers came, there was one guy who they grabbed him, and he was so anxious to escape, he left his toga behind and ran off naked. Who was that guy? Lots of people say it's only, that story is only recorded for us in the Gospel of Mark. It wasn't one of the disciples. Who was that guy? There's some pretty substantial speculation of, that was Mark. He knew that story because he was there, and he was telling it because he was talking about his own failure at the moment of truth in the Garden of Gethsemane, because possibly he also was there. And if he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, which was a very intimate moment with Jesus and his disciples, you can pretty well be sure he was in other places with Jesus, following him around during part of his ministry. So you can't tell me that Mark was not an eyewitness. Now, there's no particular gospel story that tells us that by name that Mark was there, but all the evidence points to a very substantial reason that Mark could have been an eyewitness. And again, we have the same kind of thing. Mark was a good friend of Paul's. Any information that Paul had access to, Mark would have had access to. Mark was a very good friend of Peter's. Several sources put Mark and Peter in Rome together for about 5 years at the end of the 55 to 60 A.D., about 4 years before Peter was martyred. When was the Gospel of Mark written? Some people think the Gospel of Mark was written probably in the late 50s, early 60s. They think the Gospel of Mark is, for the large part, really the Gospel of Peter. It's the story of Peter and all of his failings. You should probably know, if you haven't realized, when you read the Gospel of Mark, the disciples never do anything right in the Gospel of Mark. The disciples never say anything correct, except at one spot right in the middle of the book, when Peter asks a specific question, and Jesus asks a specific question, and Peter answers, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." In the Gospel of Mark, that is the only statement or only action by a disciple that is ever positive. Everything else in Mark is how they got everything wrong. They blew everything. They misunderstood everything. It's thought to be the Gospel of Peter. Is Mark an eyewitness account? Most likely it is. We have no direct evidence of that, but the indirect evidence tells us that it is. It's the same as the other books. It's anonymous, but every attestation we have of it in the ancient days has according to Mark on it. If somebody were if they were going to make up a gospel and tack somebody's name on it to give it credibility, they would never pick Mark. Why would they pick Mark's name to put on it? You know whose name they would have put on it? Peter's. It would have been the gospel according to Peter if they were making it up. See, all of this is evidence. All of the gospels work this way. Don't fall. I know. I see what the time is. We got to shut down. I didn't get very far. Don't fall for the cynical disregard of the authorship of the scriptures when you take the time to actually analyze and figure out what's going on here. I think and I'll just give a sort of a general statement, I think there is strong reason to believe that the authors that we know from tradition of the Bible, there's every reason to believe those are the authors of the Bible. We don't have time to talk about Jeremiah and Daniel and Nahum and Micah and Habakkuk. We don't have time, but it's going to be the same story. There's no solid evidence that these guys did not write. There's every reason to believe that they did, that the attributions we have are reliable, authentic attestations, and that we have every reason to believe that the Bible that we have is the authoritative, reliable, inspired Word of God. Thanks for coming. Sorry our time's so short.